Today we have speaking for us Professor Karen Wigen. She's chair of the Department of History at Stanford University, our fellow institution down in the South Bay, which we at Berkeley don't like to talk about as much as we could. She is a geographer by training. She actually did her master's and her PhD at Berkeley, as all right-thinking people should. Her first book was The Mapping of a Japanese Periphery, and it mapped the economic transformation of southern Nagano Prefecture in central Japan. It's an excellent book, and I've read it. Her latest book, A Malleable Map, Geographies of Restoration in Central Japan, returns to that study the place and looks at different questions, namely the role of maps, newspapers, geography readers, and gazetteers in the making of an identity of a region in the modern period. So she's been at Stanford since 2002. Before that, she taught at Duke and the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And she's published a number of articles on different topics in Japanese history, such as mountaineering, geography education, and the invention of regions, neo-traditional and otherwise. And she also was part of the 5-year Oceans Connect initiative at Duke University and co-authored a book called The Myth of Continents as part of that project, which I haven't read yet, which sounds cool though. I'm down for exposing continents as a myth. And her current preoccupation is scale as the geographical concept. And today her talk will be the Japanese archipelago, Islands at the Edge. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before I get started, I know you've already been generating some questions, but in the interest of active learning, I actually really want you to write down one question that you would like to have answered in the next hour. And it could be, I mean, field wide open, history, geography, culture, that whole ball of wax. I get wild questions from undergraduates all the time, so I'm happy to entertain broad is fine. We'll come back to those afterwards. I'm curious to know whether this very short and somewhat informal presentation will get to them, but if not, there's going to be plenty of time for questions. Then I have a couple quick questions for you. How many of you are actually middle school teachers? Okay. I speak regularly at Stanford to middle school teachers about the samurai because I know you have the middle school unit on medieval Japan. I'm happy to do that. I didn't work that up today, but I have a handout that addresses some of those issues, and it's a lot of fun. So we can do that. We can go there. How many of you grew up on the East Coast, east of the Mississippi, or have experienced that kind of weather? Okay. And how many of you have been to Japan? Oh my goodness. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Okay. Well, I gather that within the very erudite context you've already been immersed in, this will be sort of back to basics. But I thought, if indeed at the elementary school level I looked at the reader, if you really have to tackle geography, the challenge is to do it in an interesting way. Children, in fact, I did a research project on geography textbooks in Japan 100 years ago, and I got all excited about drawing conclusions about the images that Japanese adults would have had in their heads from the lessons they learned in elementary school, until I ran across a literary scholar stating very blithely, geography class was so boring, nobody was paying attention, and none of those readers make any difference. All of those images you can just throw out the window. So our challenge is to make it come alive. So I thought I would try to make it as dynamic as I can by focusing on, I know I wrote a book about the myth of continents, but Japan is on the edge of a big continent. Japan is at the edge of two things, Eurasia and the Pacific. And in a way, you can deduce a lot, if not everything, about Japanese physical, cultural, and historical geography from those two things. So that's what I thought I would focus on this morning, okay? I love these images. I'm glad that you've already been pointed, and I know you found it yourself, to Wikipedia, but there are such fantastic things. I've spent the last 3 or 4 days just pulling images for you off the web and enjoying it more than I expected. Eurasia. not just a continent, the supercontinent. And Japan, I showed this to my husband who's also a geographer. He said, that image isn't good enough. You can't even see Japan. So I added the other one at the bottom so you can see where it is. But okay, this one image we could unpack in so many different ways. Have any of you read Guns, Germs, and Steel, or are you familiar with that argument about the ease with which humans, their animals, and their ecological and material assemblages moved across in similar latitudes? Well, Japan's in that general belt, although it's way at the edge. And that is a really interesting thing. It means that whereas agriculture developed, and I'm sure you talk about this in your classes, right? Early agriculture develops primarily in these places. It doesn't get to Japan for thousands of years. Japan is a late developing fringe of the Eurasian continent, which made it a frontier for a very long time. It's also a little bit removed. I would put a big X over the word isolation or seclusion. That is a total no-no. I don't know if this has come up in your history lesson already, but yes, Japan was buffered. I like the word buffer. The Japanese rulers at various times have been able to control more than other peoples have what came in and what went out. Never totally, but they've been able to exercise some control. But Japan was never isolated. So it had all kinds of continental influences, but it took them a long time to get there. So let me talk a little bit about some of the implications of being at the eastern edge of the megacontinent. One of the implications is the weather. The Sea of, what we call the Sea of Japan, and I'm very sensitive now about this because I have many Korean students who do not call this the Sea of Japan and are very unhappy that we do. It used to be called the Sea of Korea, even on our maps, or the East Sea is what the Koreans prefer to call it. So this indeterminate body of water between Japan and Eurasia actually buffers the climate, calms it down a lot, and puts a lot of moisture into the air. What you see in this picture, though, is actually dust from the Lus Plateaus in China, which in the summertime comes into Japan in large quantities and makes the air kind of yellow. But if you were to overlay, and I'm sorry, this is one image I couldn't find on the web, I have it in books, but if you were to overlay the Japanese archipelago on a map of North America, on the east coast of North America, it runs almost perfectly from Maine to Florida. It's really, that is a very useful image for adults, at least in the United States. Kids in California probably have no concept really what that means, but I used to teach in North Carolina. It was perfect because North Carolina is right about at the latitude of the center, the heartland of Japanese civilization, and the climate there is very much like North Carolina, although with some modification. But you know, the Eurasian continent, land heats up and cools down faster than water does. That's why water buffers this climate. But big, powerful winds come off of that. Of course, we're in the typhoon belt. Of course, we get lots of intense snow activity in the winter because those big, cold winds come down from Tibet. They pick up moisture off the East Sea / Sea of Japan, and they dump it. And that's what you can actually see in this beautiful satellite photo. This is all snow, and that delimits perfectly the snow country, what is called in Japanese the snow country, and there's even a beautiful novel of that title about it. So on that side, it's kind of like the west side of the Sierra Nevada. It just all the snow gets dumped there, and there is a very distinctive regional culture in that part of the country, historically developed for dealing with these very long snowy winters. But there's enormous climatic variation, as you can imagine, if it goes all the way from Maine to Florida. So the southern part of the country is relatively warm. The summers are about the same, except in Hokkaido. Summers everywhere in Japan are really hot and muggy. That's why I wondered how many of you have lived in the east. The eastern US experiences that same kind of weather. And I think this has everything to do with a lot of elements of Japanese culture, by the way. Dealing with humidity and the mildew and mold that come with humidity, and the bugs and the creatures that come with humidity. If you haven't actually, you know, in the Bay Area, we are so relieved of all that. On the other hand, it also means your landscape is teeming with sounds. I wish I could have had a soundtrack, right? Crickets and locusts at this time of year, these shrill, loud sounds. It's just fabulous to go for a walk in the woods, and you can't not be aware of this environment all around you. So tremendous variation and just lots of life, vibrant with life. Proximity to the continent also means, and I'm sorry for the elementary nature of some of these images, that one is pretty much straight out of a museum diorama. But really, everything in the way of civilization came to Japan from the Eurasian continent. And horses are terribly important, armor and metalworking, terribly important, rice, agriculture itself, the silk cocoons, writing, money, Buddhism, statecraft, that whole ball of wax. That all came rolling in through Korea. And by the way, I don't know if this was addressed in the lecture you had yesterday, probably was, but a lot of these advanced technologies, advanced in their day, pottery included, came to Japan in the form of Korean refugees. As the Chinese empires successively invaded the Korean peninsula, the Japanese rulers had very close ties with the Korean ruling families, and their aristocracies were all intermarried, and they came in waves, and that's how Japan kind of gradually was ratcheted up into some kind of civilizational place. So yes, we are tied to the continent. It also, as I've mentioned, brings Japan tremendous amounts of water. I don't know how useful this graph is. The pictures may say it all. California, Osaka. California and Japan are roughly the same size. Japan has almost 4 times as many people, 3 times at least. It draws, for its population, its use of fresh water is less per capita than ours, but overall it's almost twice as much fresh water being used there every year. But look how little of it comes out of groundwater. It's coming straight out of rivers, straight out of the sky. So compared to Palo Alto, at least where I live, most of Japan gets 5 times as much rainfall as we do. So this is just a tremendous resource, and again, it saturates, not to borrow a metaphor there, it saturates Japanese aesthetic production, Japanese thinking about the world, that water is everywhere. It makes bathing rituals possible. It is a holy, sacramental thing. In ecological terms, and I can't stress this enough, it's been a huge advantage for Japan to be way out at the edge of Eurasia. The Mediterranean basin is pretty well deforested and eroded out. The heartlands of early agriculture in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, the Yellow River Valley, badly eroded, most of the wildlife gone, but look at Japan. It really was protected. Now it has tremendous ecological diversity because plants came over on land bridges and it shares the biota of Eurasia. But it was protected long enough into the modern period that the country was able then to secure its big timber supplies overseas without completely denuding its own homeland. And there's a famous book in our field called The Green Archipelago about the history of forestry in Japan. It's partly a natural story, it's partly a political and cultural story of careful conservation once the lumber demands of monumental building and urban building did kick in. But well, you're familiar with the look and feel of redwoods and cedars here. Japan is well blessed, and you can see it in the background. Actually, this is kind of a cool image because in the background you see the evergreens that are so important for temple building. In the foreground you see the deciduous broadleaf forest that's also very profligate, very diverse species. Anyway, this prime timber all over the mountainous spine of the country, that is what all of Japan's big monumental buildings are made out of. Isn't that glorious? That's a temple that few Japanese actually had been to until it was used as the site of a big scene in The Last Samurai movie. And now it has become a little bit more of a mecca. But just a good image. You do not find stone buildings in this place. It's all wood. And then, of course, bamboo everywhere. Very successful propagator and immensely useful, hundreds of uses for bamboo, and it's going to pop up in all kinds of artifacts. It is also true that relative certainly to Korea or China, Japan remains blessed with a pretty healthy population of all of its traditional large fauna. Wolves were hunted to extinction, but almost everything else survives, and in fact survives in sufficient numbers to be a nuisance in some cases. Japanese brown bears, you're just not going to find bears in the heartland of China, but they still exist in what are now national parks and refuges in Japan. The famous macaques. It's so fun to look up Japanese macaques on the web. All the images that come up are of them in hot springs in the snow country, having a good time. But in fact, as people have migrated out of farms and into cities, wildlife is making a comeback, and they are now very aggressive animals. They're well fed on McDonald's hamburgers and trash, and they've become quite aggressive, as have the wild boars. There are stories. So anyway, this could be a fun thing to talk about, I would think, with children. Children are fascinated by animals, and Japan has a lot of them. Okay. One more thing about proximity to Eurasia is the dangers that come over. It's not only useful good things, but dangers too. You can imagine, but you probably know what this is. Yeah, rendition of the Mongol invaders in Japan being protected by the kamikaze, supposed kamikaze that blew apart their fleet. Very interesting long debates among historians about exactly how important that typhoon was in breaking up the Mongol fleet. But in any case, yes, the Mongols came, they tried to conquer, they did not succeed in conquering. And that's really one of the kind of tropes of Japanese history, is that they have not been successfully invaded very often. But they were invaded by the major infectious diseases that are part of the Eurasian complex. And this is important. Measles and smallpox in particular, they didn't come to Japan till late. We have historical documents that show the transition from these diseases from epidemic to endemic status, when they finally got enculturated in the human population and became diseases of childhood, so that most adults would not be vulnerable to waves of those. And that is a huge difference from the New World. This is an image from the era of Spanish settlement in North America. And as you know, smallpox and measles were huge killers in the Americas. And that just didn't happen in Japan. Japan's an island country, but it was not vulnerable in the way of so many other islands. Really, the Americas were the massive island of the world in ecological terms. And just look at this population graph. Absolute numbers we can debate, but the general shape of it is absolutely clear. Native Americans, they're now saying, probably reduced to 1/10 of what they started out before 1492. Japan, from 1492, you have a century of very active growth, and then virtually stable until about 1840, when it just takes off.
Was the die-off just from infectious diseases?
In the Americas?
Yeah.
That was the primary killer. There are other things too, but this is what even moved ahead of the Europeans. Got into the population and spread so rapidly, and people were just enormously vulnerable. So the fact that Japanese are not vulnerable means that in the wonderful book Ecological Imperialism, I don't know if you've encountered that, but it's a very interesting story, analysis of the extent to which germs and animals, actually, and plants helped the Europeans colonize other parts of the world. East Asia has a tiny little chapter. It's the exception that proves the rule. It was not colonized in the same ways because its people were robust and resistant. So that is a story I always stress when I start my classes. Okay, so we'll get back to it, but that's basically, from my very macro point of view, what Japan gets out of being at the edge of Eurasia. How about being at the edge of the Pacific? That's also a very large story. A rather wonderful 19th century map from a period in the late 1800s when scientists and sailors and whalers were very interested in trying to understand the currents and wind patterns in the Pacific. And as you probably know, Japan's at the confluence of some very complicated currents, warm and cold currents coming together there, tremendous amount of upwelling, very big activity. So what does it mean to be at the edge of the Pacific? Well, the Pacific is a big place. And this is worth stressing. On the one hand, maritime location brought the Japanese trade accessibility, inexpensive, relatively safe access to the primary markets that the Europeans too began to covet in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. They could sail coastal sailing along the shores of China down into Southeast Asia and come home with all kinds of luxury and rare commodities. Camphor wood, sandalwood, bêche de mer, these very strange sea cucumber objects, pearls, interesting Buddhist artifacts from Southeast Asia, all kinds of Buddhist texts that came through South China and Southeast Asia. And in fact, for a brief period in the early 1600s, there were Japan towns spread around throughout this region. I'm sure you heard yesterday about the edicts that closed that off in the 1630s. It didn't last very long, but it was a very important part of the making of modern Japan. And being on the edge of the ocean also has brought abundant seafood. And this is a theme in Japanese art, as well it should be. You can see in the lower right corner, there's actually even an image of a whale. Japanese whaling was not transoceanic historically because whales came right up the coast. And Japanese fishermen didn't have to go very far to chase them. The upper right image is actually women pearl divers, one of the very highly romanticized occupational groups in Japan, and of course fishermen. And I just want to kind of impress visually on you how pervasive and important fishing has been. Because Japan's an archipelago and it's well watered, there are rivers everywhere, there's a lot of marshlands historically. Much of this has been reclaimed and turned into asphalt now. You can't see it all, but historically, very hard to overemphasize how important these very rich estuaries and coastal waterways have been, just teeming with marine life, including gardening of the ocean, right? The collecting of sea plants. I want to avoid the use of the word weed because it really doesn't convey the value and importance of these foods, which are quite beautiful and very nutritious. And again, it emerge as a theme throughout history.
And latitude-wise, compared to the West Coast, if it's about the size of California, but where is it latitude-wise?
So, because it would overlay perfectly on the east coast of the United States, and you can kind of see here, basically it would overlay on the west coast too. So Hokkaido is about at the latitude of Washington. Tohoku, where the big earthquake was, would be about Oregon, and the central heartland of Japan would line up with California. So that's probably a useful thing to know. I was delighted to find both of these images because what I have done when I speak to middle school teachers is bring a globe in the room and spin it so the Pacific faces them. And just to convey how big this ocean is. When that side of the globe is facing, you can't see land really at all. And almost all of our maps slice it through the middle, so we don't have a very good sense of that. Japanese maps do a better job. They tend to put Japan at the middle so the Pacific stays intact, and this is a very precious and rare example of a world map you can get on the web that doesn't split the Pacific down the middle, so you can get a sense of how big it is. Why does that matter? Partly because it was really hard to navigate those currents. The big gyre in the northern Pacific is extremely powerful, and if you get caught in it, you could go all the way across the world. There's archaeological and textual evidence of Japanese sailors being shipwrecked in Vancouver, in Alaska, in Baja California, even in Mexico. So once you get caught in that current, you could get deposited way over there. This might be a fun kind of story to use actually in a classroom. I don't know if it fits any of your themes. This happens to be an older book whose cover I showed you because I thought it was kind of delightful, but there's also a new one if you're interested called Drifting Toward the Southeast, which is a story about this particular castaway, useful as an anecdote because he got shipwrecked as a child. He was 14 years old. A young sailor on board a vessel that actually got lost in a storm very quickly and very close off Japan, shipwrecked just south of the country right here in the Bonin Islands, and was picked up by an American whaling vessel that took it across the Pacific, around the Cape, and he ended up going to high school in Amherst, California. I mean, it's Amherst, Massachusetts, sorry. And very importantly and dramatically, he ended up going back to Japan with Commodore Perry and serving as an interpreter on the first American mission in Japan. Who else had both both English and Japanese. Right, so drifting toward the southeast, it's also delightful because it's kind of like a primary source of facsimile reproduction of some early drawings and maps that came out of his adventures. Very delightful. But because sailors could easily get blown off course if they get far off the coast, almost all historical shipping around Japan stayed within sight of land. And if you look closely at pictures of ships, you'll see land in the background, almost always. It was coastal sailing. They are not striking out. It wasn't like the Indian Ocean is the perfect counterpart. Indian Ocean, very regular winds. One season they go to the southwest to Africa, the other season they come back up to India. You could count on that. Every 6 months you could go back and forth. The Pacific, as far as they knew, they go out, they're stuck. They didn't know, and even Europeans didn't know how to get all the way around those giant ocean gyres for hundreds of years. It took a long time to master that. So most Japanese sailors stay close to home. That's important to know. Some maps, I have a whole talk about this, and I use this as a foil because not all of them do, but some maps do suggest a fear of the ocean, and if you zoom in on the Pacific on this one, it's actually a big black dragon. That's really quite delightful. Not reproduced in most maps of Japan, unfortunately, but that's really kind of a precious symbol. And the most compelling analysis I have heard by an art historian of this overly famous Hokusai print of the Great Wave, which was made and published and caught fire in the Japanese imagination and now the global imagination in the 1840s, is that this is the first image of Japan from the sea. And what was coming from the sea in this period was foreign ships, very scary things from across the ocean, and there is a real sense of danger in these tumultuous waves and the sense that these little craft could easily capsize out there. So the sense that what is brought by across the ocean is a very dangerous thing is worth recalling. Now, being located on the edge of the Pacific also brought natural hazards as well as kind of cultural and shipping hazards. And one has to talk about earthquakes, right? This is the best image I have found that shows how Japan is indeed at the edge of probably the two largest tectonic plates on the globe. So the Pacific plate is truly massive. Unlike the Atlantic plate, which is split down the middle and the spreading is happening right in the middle, in the Pacific it's happening much closer to the Americas and it's pushing up this way right against Japan. So this plate's headed that way. Meanwhile, the Eurasian plate is headed the other way and they are clashing right at Japan. So you can see the little red dots there, and there's another one I'll show you in just a second, indicating where the location of earthquakes of a magnitude of 5 or greater on the Richter scale have happened in the last, 40 years or so since there's been systematic data collection. Look how concentrated they are right on that side where those two plates are coming together. That's not an incidental thing for the Japanese. This is, as I said, another image that again shows the heavy concentration of earthquakes in that part of Japan, and a very rare and precious example of a subduction diagram that's moving in the right direction to show what it looks like when an oceanic plate is subducting under a continental crust on that side. Almost all of the ones that we find are oriented the other way to show how it works in California, or at least if not here, because here it's slipping, but they're basically oriented for South Atlantic. All right, so we have earthquakes and tsunamis. The recent horrific one we're now learning as we read more about it is well precedented in Japanese history. There have been many enormous tsunamis from earthquakes that occurred either offshore or elsewhere along the Pacific Rim. That's an old theme in Japanese life and art. And one of the implications is cities could not be built out of stone. There's a wonderful book now called Earthquake Nation, a study of the modernization of architecture and seismic science in Japan. And it starts out with a kind of tongue-in-cheek chapter about the first professional architects who came to Japan during the Meiji period from Europe, from London in particular. and tried to impress upon the Japanese that their top-heavy temples were never going to survive an earthquake and they needed to build in the Victorian style, which they proceeded to do for about 15 years until the first major earthquake came along and leveled it all. And since then the Japanese have not only reverted to some of their more traditional styles, but also have become leaders in seismic science worldwide. But traditionally, they intelligently built out of wood. I have to say, even the castles, and this is very arresting and important for students to hear. These beautiful castles, you wouldn't necessarily know to see it, but everything above the foundation level is wood. And so, of course, the big hazard with earthquakes was fire. And Japanese cities and monuments have burned so often that, as those of you who've been to Japan probably know, most of what you see is a reconstruction. Even if it's a 400-year-old reconstruction of a 1,000-year-old temple, very few original structures remain. They've almost all burned at some point and had to be rebuilt. Precious for a historian, I'll just point out what these documents are. These are some of the first newspapers that were ever published in Japan. They're broadsheets. In the wake of a big earthquake, the reading public was eager for news, and with ample illustrations, they got it. People who have lived through 9/11 can appreciate how firemen become heroes in a country that experiences disasters, where firemen go and rescue people and put out the flames. And in fact, in Edo historically, the firemen were, they really became a symbol of the gutsiness and macho culture of the city. And even now, they have annual festivals where they celebrate the acrobatic skills that they had to master to climb up on top of roofs and pull off roof tiles and so on to open up houses in the event of fire. But the other thing besides earthquakes that being on the Pacific Rim means for Japan is volcanism and uplift. So that's the source of the archipelago as a physical structure. It's all created out of the clash of these two giant titanic plates. Dozens of volcanoes, but many, many more granite ridges that are simply crushed and pushed up out of the earth. And I don't know if you've experienced the Japanese Alps. They don't go as high as the European Alps, but they're very serious mountains. And this is what the topography in the central part of Japan actually does look like. A useful statistic that I like to pass on to my classes is that only about 15% of the land of Japan has a slope of 15 degrees or less. And that's a traditional rule of thumb for what can be farmed. Peruvian farmers defied that. They tied ropes around rocks or trees so that they wouldn't fall off of their steeply sloped fields, and they went into much more steeply sloped places. But as a rule of thumb, at least in East Asian agriculture, 15-degree slope is about what you can handle. And you can see, I think, pretty clearly from this map how little land there is in that green and even yellow color band. You have to remember that Hokkaido, and I hope this came across in your lecture yesterday, Hokkaido was not traditionally part of the Japanese nation. It has, and that's where a lot of that land would be. But historically, the real heartland was the Kyoto-Osaka area, and this plain, the Nagoya plain and the Kanto plain around Edo, what is now Tokyo, were really historically horse-raising grasslands 1,000 years ago. It's only really within the last 500 years that they've come seriously under cultivation. So this is what the landscape looks like in much of the part of the country that had to support human life. It's very hilly, it's very diverse, often close to the ocean. If not close to the ocean, it's got rivers running through it. And much of traditional kind of village life, communal life, even statecraft has been generated by the necessity of making a living, supporting communal life in that kind of setting. And I know it's almost cliche, but the central requirement was water control. That's particularly true when you're farming paddy rice, which requires control, precise day-to-day control of how much water comes in and goes out of individual fields. That really exacerbated it, but in this kind of environment, you would have had to exert control over water anyway. One of the most useful technologies for doing that was the water wheel. And I think it's worth emphasizing to young people, water wheel technology exists in medieval Europe, it exists in medieval East Asia, but it's not put to the same ends. For the most part, water wheels in Japan were used to lift water out of irrigation ditches into fields. That's what it was for. You know, in early America, if you go to visit some of those kind of remaining ruins on the East Coast or parks, museums, you see water wheels that are turned by the natural force of the water, and that power is being used to grind grain. Well, you don't have to grind rice anyway. You can mill it pretty simply. You're not grinding it all the way down into flour to make bread. This is what most, I think this picture may itself be from China, but the same technology was used in Japan. And maintaining water wheels for this kind of purpose gives you a little sense of the labor intensivity, the engineering. This was a highly engineered landscape for hundreds of years. I guess that's an important point. And there are some precious documentary records of this, the modernization of Japan's engineered landscape in the form of historical photographs taken during the occupation. From the 30s, actually starting in the 30s even within Japan, but when the Americans were there in the 40s, in the mid to late 40s, very interesting evidence of this, in this case, a large brigade of women, farm women, coming down, moving rocks, establishing clear channels for both navigation and for water to flow through during the high flood season, and men laying riprap along the banks to protect from erosion when the water level was really high. So most of the river channels that you'll see, even way up country in Japan today, have this kind of stone work laid along them. The amount of, now it's concrete too, but the amount of concrete and stone in the landscape in Japan, it's almost depressing, actually. You don't very often find a natural looking river. There are over 3,000 named dams in Japan, and probably thousands more at this scale, just little small water control devices way, way, way up these streams. So this is really what the waterscape looks like in Japan today. This is a scenic river that runs through the heart of Kyoto. Sunday picnickers going out, sitting along the concrete embankment as cars whiz by. But trust me, in a city that's as packed and hot as Kyoto in the summer, this is still a cool, natural site, and it's a place people are happy to be. And I had to throw in at least one picture of those tetrahedrons, the giant tetrahedrons of concrete that line the coast as well, trying to protect shoreline from wave action and erosion. So a very engineered landscape. This takes a lot of work. There's a famous book written by a Berkeley historian, actually, that celebrates or has coined the term industrious revolution to talk about the Japanese early modern counterpart to Europe's industrial revolution. It was elbow grease and backbreaking labor of women as well as men that really sustained a very intensive agrarian-based economy. And clearing irrigation ditches is one of those communal labors that just had to be continually organized. But that's what it took to be able to push rice up into all of these little valleys, as far north as the climate would allow, and support what is historically a pretty significant population. You know, that Japan, we sometimes say it's a small country, but it had a population comparable to France or Germany. Yes?
So curious, because they have all these natural dams throughout, what does it do to the natural population of fish?
It's been devastating.
I was going to say,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
that's one of the fights that goes on here.
That's right.
Regarding
That's right.
counties and
That's
the,
right.
you know, the tributaries regarding the
Right.
salmon, and salmon trying to make
Right.
its way up to their natural streams.
That's right. So the similar fights are going on in Japan. There are efforts to create spawning runs so that fish can go upstream around the dams. There are also lots of fish seeding, kind of fish hatcheries that will bring fish upstream so that they have a chance to settle, because people want to go and fish in those mountain streams higher up, but the fish can't move back and forth. So yeah, it's a big issue. It's a big issue.
Is the water where the people live? I mean, are fresh water for drinking, and are they look, if
Right.
not, are they looking at desalinization?
They are much more blessed with drinking water in the zones where people live than many other parts of the world. Yes.
So they can just go out and drink fresh water?
Pretty much. Groundwater is being depleted under Tokyo, but not at the rates that is happening under other big megacities in the world. Considering its size, it's really quite remarkable, actually, that they've been okay. They don't rely on aquifers nearly as much as on just runoff, surface runoff. So that's been very valuable. Reservoirs are all dotted the country all over too. But I kind of like this image too. I took my own children to Japan for a spring teaching gig a few years back, and I was struck that my son was struck by the sharp line that you see between land uses. That whether it's agricultural or urban, human occupancy seems to stop very abruptly at a forest edge, and then boom, the mountain goes up and it's green and protected. You don't have suburban encroachment on the hillsides to the same extent that you see in California, for instance. Very intense zoning to protect agriculture and forestry both. Yeah.
So do the rivers suffer from like pesticide runoff, or is that's another major issue here too?
Yep.
But I don't know about rice farming and that.
Yes, and again, there's a lot of action on that, as you can imagine. There's a big community of alternative and organic farmers growing in Japan. One of the worst offenders in pesticide runoff is golf courses, and Japan is saturated with golf courses.
Oh, yeah. Golf course is big for them.
It is, although, you know, it seems to have crested. The Generation X is not as interested in golfing as their 50 and 60-year-old parents, so that may get better. But yes, I mean, they're part of the same global agro-industrial complex that we are, so that's certainly an issue. Just for fun, I wanted to show you, juxtapose some images of rice transplanting, an indication of the labor-intensive form that farming has taken. So traditional as of 100 years ago, modern with the mini tractors that do this automatically behind the farmer, but at such a small scale.
What are they actually doing? Are they planting plants or
That's right. So those are seedlings. They've been in a nursery through the winter. It's now early spring. They're coming out and they're actually going to put little plugs at very even intervals in the ground. And because they're planted so systematically, and historically women were the main transplanters, and they also were very systematic about spacing them, that allows you to identify weeds as the things that are going up in between those rows. The weeds have learned to mimic rice so well that otherwise, I tried weeding one day in a rice field, and the farmer finally kicked me out because I couldn't tell what I was supposed to be pulling. I just have to add too, my folks grew up on big wheat farms in Washington State, and when they went to Japan, they just dropped their jaw and said, "This isn't farming, this is gardening." It's that level of intensive, small-scale cultivation. It's a very different style, and all that complex then allows, along the coast of the Sea of Japan and other places where you do get larger floodplains, allows for this very beautiful agro landscape that...
And is that planted by airplane?
No, actually that's one of the things they find remarkable is airplanes in agriculture. This would be tractor though. Those very even rows, it's all tractor planted. So just... Well, different parts of it are subject to flooding very regularly.
I'm just thinking of the Nile as well.
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay.
Really, Nile.
So there is not a seasonal regularity to a kind of alternation between, in the case of the Nile, it's not rainfall, is it? Because it comes during the dry season, but it's outflow from the mountains. We don't have that kind of sharp rhythm because the rainfall is fairly evenly distributed throughout the year in Japan. There are bursts. June actually happens to be a real rainy month, and the winter gets a lot of rain. But in any case, the main flooding season is probably the typhoon season, when you do get the big tropical storms coming through, especially in the southern and western half of the country. Does that answer your question? Okay. So just one more time to revisit the big macro pattern. There are about 100 different pockets little valleys around Japan, little, at various scales, small to large, where the major rice cultivation and proto-urban settlement has happened. There were, 100 major castle towns spread around the country, and they're very widely dispersed. So this is another of the implications of this whole geographical configuration is waterways, which are largely invisible now because it's precisely over canals that the country's planners 100 years ago started building their superhighways. All the elevated roads in Tokyo run right over these canals. But historically, waterways were the main arteries of the country's transportation system. And once you're alert to that, you'll see it everywhere in Japanese traditional art and landscapes. I'm mostly showing this just because I love to just stare at this beautiful image. The inland sea. So many things you could get out of this, right? I think this is from the same snowy day, I don't know, but this inland sea passage that runs between Honshu, Kyushu, and Shikoku is really the heartland of traditional Japanese culture, and it's around a water body, not around a plain. Because it was a very protected set of harbors, set of sea lanes, very easy to move back and forth, and all the major cities, all the major early burial mounds, all the old archaeological ruins, they're all in that region. And you can see relatively close access to Korea with Tsushima Island there in the middle as a hopping off point. And maps indicate the importance of waterways as roads too. I think this is a good indication. A red stripe is the way highways are signaled on all the road maps I've looked at, and there it is running right through the inland sea. Every historical city well served by canals. This happens to be Osaka, which was the kitchen of Japan. You can see all of this, all of these are canals running through the city, like fingers coming out to the sea. That's how you got goods in and out. And the same in Edo, the capital, the shogun's capital. Canals were used as moats to some extent, but much more importantly, once the peace was established, they were transportation corridors. Isn't that fantastic? Almost completely invisible now. Thank goodness we have these old images. There are a few places where historical preservation... I'm sorry?
So what has overtaken those waterways? Highways now?
Yes, yes, right. Like I said, elevated highways often because land was densely inhabited. They did exert eminent domain and raise houses sometimes, but one place where you could get land was running over a waterway. So it did open up the city for trucks, which is what kind of replaced them. Thank goodness in some smaller historical towns they've been preserved and you can still see them. And then I just had to show you that when you kind of get to the end of the waterway system, because you can't really pull boats up the rivers in these very steep mountains, then you have to transfer goods to pack horse trains. And interestingly, historically, you will not see a lot of pictures of wagons in Japan, right? Rich people were carried in palanquins, samurai rode horses, peasants did this. They walked and they put their goods on the backs of horses. It was partly to avoid rutting of roads in this very wet climate. And it was partly a prestige issue that only the very wealthy were allowed to have carriages, and they were only allowed to run them on the paved streets of the city. That's actually from the cover of my book, as some of you may know, which was about pack horse trains. So just to sum up a little bit, land of contrasts, oh my God, what place is not a land of contrasts? But Japan certainly is. You get landscapes like this, right? Very mixed use, although each use seems to be clustered and kind of, there seems to be a very careful accounting for all these different pieces that have to come together in the quilt patchwork that is the city, and still tremendous vulnerability. If anything, at a larger scale than it was historically. And so I just thought I would highlight a few of the cultural themes that I'm sure you're going to be playing with in folktales and art and artifacts. Certainly a sense of life as fleeting. I don't know if you can tell, this is actually an image of... It's in the aftermath of an urban fire, which may have been set off by an earthquake. So it's refugees kind of wandering through the city, trying to salvage their possessions, talk to their neighbors, but a sense of the evanescence of life. That's just the way it is. The cherry blossoms are celebrated precisely because they're only here for 3 or 4 days, and then they're gone. And you embrace that because this is where you've lived, and it could go up in smoke any day. So that is a really long-standing theme in Japanese literature, and Japanese religion, Japanese art. I know you've all seen images like this. I don't want to romanticize that the Japanese have a special affinity with nature, because what they've actually done to their cities and their highly engineered waterways suggests otherwise. But there is no question that within their cultural repertoire, there is a place for a real reverence toward the landscape and toward the sacred tied to place. There is a keen awareness of the seasons, which only made sense to me, a kid who grew up in Ohio where spring lasted for 2 weeks and fall lasted for 2 weeks if you were lucky, and otherwise it was these long monotonous summers and winters. Only made sense to me when I went there and realized, oh, each season really does unfold over 3 months. It's really true. And spring is long and spectacular, and it just rolls out. And fall is long and spectacular and rolls out. You really do begin to understand that. And the sound effects in the midst of that very alive woodland never let you forget what time of year it is. And the final theme I want to leave you with is the love of insects. This is nothing new in Japan. This is a major theme. It goes all the way back to the tale of Genji. You can find talk about the insects, their sounds. The silkworm, of course, is something that Japanese women have long had intimate familiarity with. The cricket cages, the idea that an insect could be a pet and that a cricket cage is an aesthetic object, that is very much an East Asian contribution to global culture. And I have been recently delighted to learn from an amazing book called Insectopedia about the insect boys of Japan as the pioneers of manga and anime. The creator of Pokemon collected bugs as a child, and this particular image gathers into one place all the Pokemon creatures that are based on insect life. There's that many of them. I don't know if any other culture in the world is giving global pop that, but the Japanese are. And that surely is something third graders could get excited about. Are they still doing Pokemon?
Pokemon will never die.
And likewise, Miyazaki Hayao. I don't know if you people are familiar with the movies of Miyazaki Hayao. He is Japan's, I think, much wiser and more organic answer to Walt Disney. A very interesting creature. Yes, he did Howl's Moving Castle and Princess Mononoke and Kiki's Delivery Service and The Secret World of Arrietty. Amazing repertoire. They're almost all outstanding, and the recreation of this ecological environment is stupendous. He too was an insect collector as a child. And again, have you hugged a bug today? It's the caption that goes with this particular drawing. Who else? Who else creates miniature people precisely so that they can be inhabiting a landscape full of insects? And I just want to recommend, if you haven't already seen it, what may be his signature children's film creation, My Neighbor Totoro. The fantastical creatures in it are, you know, whatever. You could, they're very much like the kinds of things that come out of Japanese folktales of the past, actually. But the setting, the way he recreates what a farm landscape looks like in, say, 1950s Japan is just, it's stunning to a historian. I have never seen it done as well anywhere else. So thank you for your attention. And now you can tell me if I've answered your question.
Is that a real bug?
That's a real bug. A rhinoceros beetle, or stag beetle, one of the very prized insects that you can collect around Japan.
Kind of lucky to get that.
Exactly. Exactly. So you all had written questions. I have no idea if I've answered them or if there are some that you want to bring up, but I'm happy to entertain questions, and I think I have at least another little while to do that. Yes?
So it's a broad question because middle school is broad. So what do you think are the most important things 7th grade students should know about Japan?
Cue the handout. So on the front side of this is the 8 things to know about Japanese history and geography. I think I must have given this table extra copies, right? Yeah, thanks. It's kind of a summary of the things I've already gone over. Did you get some? Okay. But on the back side are my kind of big themes that I've emphasized with the middle school teachers. So the first one, probably not. This is just permission to use the words classical, medieval, and early modern when you're speaking about Japan. It works really well. Feudal is fun. It works for me. It's absolutely true that depending on how strict a definition you apply, it may or may not work. But you have horse riding warriors controlling fiefs from castles. Looks familiar. And then that gives you a foil from which you can start to explore the differences. They don't develop chivalry. There are some interesting differences. But yes, I suppose the issues in point 6. Again, I don't want to just be repeating stuff you've already heard, and I wish I had been able to hear your history lecture yesterday. But it is here's one of the big take-homes for me about Japanese history. So from that Eurasian connection, the Japanese import a very highly evolved kind of statecraft model from one of the places that has had agriculture and cities for 2,000 years already. And they try to plop it down on top of what is still basically a tribal society. Clans, yes, they have agriculture, they've had that for a few generations. But they're basically warrior clans with a very strong kinship network, importing a bureaucratic model designed for governing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. It didn't fit. For a millennium, it didn't fit. And what happened was they're rational, right? So they start negotiating other ways to actually run the country underneath this system. And the visual symbol of this that I carry around in my own head is an architectural one. So you probably are familiar with the highly symmetrical kind of cosmological layout of a Chinese city, likewise Chinese palaces and reception rooms, all the official government buildings, strictly symmetrical, left, right, very strongly linear. That comes into Japan, and over the course of a few centuries, it gets lopsided. If you look at the layout of the Tokugawa Palace in Kyoto, and if you have a chance to go there, it is really a spectacular historically preserved place. It's like a set of stacking boxes front to back. I'm not saying vertical, it's front to back as you go in through it. But instead of going straight back in a quarter like you would at Tiananmen, right, in the Forbidden City, you go at an angle. And it's all designed to work around the natural beauty of this particular setting, which has a pond in which they laid out the rocks. And that's a beautiful symbol to me of how the Japanese took notions, very bureaucratic, kind of universal, strong notions from China and said, well, yeah, let's just adapt that. And so you get a torque. And that, how it is that kin groups actually ran the state, eventually undermined the state, set up their own parallel estates that weren't taxed, and thereby gave room for and rise to the samurai. That's a really important and interesting story. You have to have a private police force if you're going to pull your land out of taxation. And you pull your land out of taxation because this whole bureaucratic thing just doesn't quite fit. So that's basically a very crude version of number 6 there. Number 7, one of the other big take-homes about Japanese history is there was no regicide. The big dynastic turnovers in China have no counterpart in Japan. And that's because the emperor remained useful. It's like a cricket in a cage. You carry him around, right? Or a bird in a golden cage. That's what he was compared to. Very useful, could be manipulated. If one emperor didn't work for you, you could remove him, kill him, but still preserve the line, because real power lay elsewhere. And eventually the emperor gets ensconced in layers of regents. Even the regents lose their power, and then it's the shogun, and then eventually even the shogun wasn't very powerful, but you keep that shogun there, and then you, the daimyo, are actually running things. But you keep all those layers in the middle for legitimation and sanction. I think that's a very interesting theme in Japanese history too. And the last one I put here, I guess, the Tokugawa shoguns unified the realm, but on a more pragmatic basis, and peacekeeping was the #1 goal. So my memory is that the middle school unit focuses on medieval Japan, right? Which ends with the end of the big civil wars. The civil wars of the late 1400s into the 1500s generate most of the movies about the samurai, most of our stereotypical images, the sword fights, and so on. The Tokugawa, the cleverness of the Tokugawa was to find a way to put civil war to an end, which isn't easy because their whole system was based on the rewards of war being the gifts that you give to your followers, and once those come to an end, it's hard to generate the loyalty that you need. They found alternative modes of generating income and loyalty. It helped that they stumbled on and got control of the biggest silver mine in Japan. Very, very important for underwriting their early years of rule. But the upshot is that for half of the 800 years during which Japan was run by samurai, those samurai were basically accountants, and they were not fighting actively. Their swords became very rusty, and most of them really didn't know how to use them.
Did you say accountants?
Mm-hmm. Bean counters. You know, they became the bureaucrats who actually ran the country. They got stipends, they got pulled off the land, they were given salaries, and they were told, you know, you will run the office of the ministry that oversees the roads, and you will work in the ministry that oversees rice irrigation, and you will work in the ministry that takes charge of the temples. So it's very unglamorous, and I love to counter students' romantic images of the samurai by reminding them half of them are women, because it's a caste group, so half of the samurai caste were women. Lots of them were children or old people, and for half of their history, none of them were fighting. So if you really want to study just samurai swordplay, you're in the wrong class. Yes?
I have a question about the role of arts or art production, because other than the shogun, like, I'm not an expert in Japanese history, but during the Edo period. So other than the shogun, you have this agricultural society or people fishing, that's very labor intensive. So what proportion, I mean, who was benefiting from the arts?
Who are the patrons?
And what role did that play in the everyday, you know,
right.
peasant life?
That's a really good question. So you got a brief introduction to the Lady Murasaki Shikibu story. She represents maybe the 1%. Or less than 1% in those days. Kyoto, in the heyday of the court, probably the aristocrats represented 6,000 people. I mean, it's a tiny, tiny group out of the whole country. And so the only popular arts that we would have from before the Edo period are truly folk tales. We're not going to have any visual or artifact kinds of arts. Maybe pottery, but not much else that's preserved that was really designed for aesthetic purposes. So the patrons would historically be the ruling family, whether that's samurai or aristocracy, or the big temples. And Buddhism went hand in glove with statecraft in Japan. We think of Zen as a very clean, clear, sit on a mat, meditate, there are no objects in sight, but Zen temples and all Japanese Buddhist temples are full of imagery, and much of it very ornate. There's a whole school of esoteric Buddhism where mandalas and beautiful art was seen as one of the ways to access the divine. So temples were also very important patrons of art historically, and would have been one of the few places where ordinary people could come in contact with beautiful objects, because the rich kept their beautiful objects behind very high walls, and ordinary people did not get to see them. temples were different. Yeah.
Could you explain like modern Japanese trends in architecture and micro-housing and how things are going today?
Oh, that's a tall order. So explain it in what sense? I mean, what is it that interests you about that?
Like, I don't know, we didn't really get into cities. Like, is there any fun facts about modern cities?
Well, here are some big background points. More than half of urban Japan was burned and destroyed in World War II. And that's our fault. The Americans decided to firebomb Japanese cities. And really, it's 60-some% of all the urban infrastructure just was razed to the ground. What replaced it in a period, and people just needed places to live.
A 7-year period to help rebuild.
Yeah, we took a 7-year period to help rebuild. I'm just saying that this has a major impact on what you get.
Right.
It looks a little bit like Soviet realism.
Got it.
A lot of Japanese urban weave is not very attractive. It's a lot of concrete, and it doesn't age very well. Historically, for a combination of reasons, some of which you can imagine, architecture has been seen as temporary. You don't have the same approach toward housing that you would in France, where a family inherits a stone apartment that they've lived in for generations.
Oh, so they have a different viewpoint in Japan versus Europe. Because I know one thing that happened during World War II, I know like when we destroyed Japan in World War II, we made painstakingly viewpoints not to destroy Italy when we were bombing Italy, to keep explorers in certain regions trying to save the art.
I believe that. I believe that.
There were whole units that went from the United States were art historians. They were going through and trying to get the art back.
I believe that because a similar kind of impetus animated the protection of Kyoto from firebombing. And that is one reason why that is a great place to go if you visit Japan, because it wasn't firebombed, and there still are, I mean, it had its own fires and earthquakes over the centuries, but that particular destructive wave was spared there. I mean, I'm not sure what I don't know a lot about the current trend toward micro-housing. I know that Japanese population is entering a period of decline. Families are tiny. There are a lot of young people who are not marrying or not having children, or both. And it makes a lot of sense that there's going to be a kind of atomization of living spaces, desirable living spaces. You're not housing extended families in most of the country anymore the way it was done for the last 3 centuries at least. And also, I will say, this is one of the most urban-loving peoples I've ever met. Most of the teenagers in Japan want to be in Tokyo. They really want to be in Tokyo. There's nowhere else to be. Half of the universities in the country are in Tokyo. It's like putting Boston on top of DC on top of Manhattan. And of course, the energy level there is very, very high, and it's very exciting, and lots of neon, and you stay up all night. And so that, I mean, I haven't shown that, but that, I think it's worth knowing that there's a technophilia that runs deep through Japanese culture. We have lots of movies that are kind of Armageddon scenarios, end of the world, apocalypse scenarios. They have a lot of movies embracing technology, and technology could make the world better. That's an interesting thing. And likewise, I think there's been a real embrace of urban density and urban living. Yes?
I was just curious because so much influence came through Korea, and then you said there was like Korean refugees, yet the Japanese have not been known for treating Koreans kindly, and we heard from the lecturer yesterday that the imperial family is hesitant to, or may never open up some of these tombs and find out that they have Korean blood in their bloodline. So how do you explain such discrimination towards the Koreans? It's
a more modern artifact of Japan's imperial misadventures than anything else. So in the early years of the Japanese imperial family in the 6th and 7th century, to have Korean lineage was an asset, and it was not hidden. It was very overt. That was prestigious. That was high culture, came from the continent. But in the imperial period, the tables were turned around in the early 20th century. Japan colonized Korea, made a big point about our common heritage, our common blood, but you are the stepchild, right? You are the lesser brothers and sisters, and there was a lot of overt discrimination. In fact, in the wake of the big Tokyo earthquake in 1923, there's tremendous mob riots afterwards where people went out and lynched and killed Koreans, thinking that somehow they were to blame for this horrible disaster. So I'm glad that was brought up. But these things are not constants. I guess that's what I would say. It's kind of an artifact of history.
And are Koreans born in Japan now allowed to be Japanese citizens because they used to not?
Historically, no. I mean, they've maintained that a lot of them are still citizens of North Korea, which is a very strange thing because their ancestors immigrated to Japan before North and South Korea split, before the Korean War.
So you mean to tell me they're not even acknowledged the fact that they came to Japan and are living in Japan?
They're acknowledged as a minority, but they are not seen as truly Japanese. And now they themselves have very complicated feelings about it and want to hold on to their Korean heritage, send their children to Korean language schools, keep their Korean names, which at one point they were not allowed to do. So they have not had, for a long time, the choice over whether they assimilated or not. In certain periods, they were forcibly assimilated. They had to speak Japanese and take Japanese names. In other periods, they weren't allowed to speak Japanese or take Japanese names. So that, you can imagine the roiling kind of identity sense that that creates.
On that same topic, is there also discrimination towards people who maybe live on the far ends of the, you know, on the upper, I'm not very familiar with this, but are there people who live far to the north and they're seen as different, like in England and Scotland or something?
Right. So yes and no. The far extremes of the archipelago are culturally very distinctive and very interesting places. And so it's, depending on the person, your response to that could be either very romantic or very discriminatory. But I would say that being from a rural place, even if it's near the heartland, can create a stigma. There's a phrase, inaka-kusai, which means stinking of the country. Like you smell like onions. And that, you hear that. You actually hear that. So
Is that a derogatory thing?
That's a derogatory thing.
Yes.
Yes.
Just curious, because you don't know in certain countries. I'm like, oh, I don't know, is that derogatory or is that a compliment?
And again, there are countercultural currents in communities that embrace that and celebrate everything that's rustic and organic and local, just as here.
Yeah, we do
But,
that with the Appalachian Mountains.
Right. So that would be a good analogy. Yes?
What about the Sea of Japan and the islands controversy with China?
Oh boy, that's a big one. I actually teach a course called Maps, Borders, and Conflict in East Asia, and we end up spending a lot of time on that. I guess the shorthand I would say is if you look at old maps, which is what I do for a living, you will slowly come to the conclusion that they are not going to help resolve this conflict because nobody cared about those islands historically, and borders anyway, even land borders were not carefully delineated historically in East Asia. It was much more savvy to leave buffers in between big, powerful people who might otherwise fight with each other and not worry too much about exactly where you draw a line. Now we've entered a new cartographic regime where we have to have sharp boundaries, and it's kind of a tragedy. It'd be nice if we could find ways to fudge it again. And I urged my students to try to come up with creative sharing solutions, because I don't see any other way to do it. There's historical pride now at stake on all sides. And that's really what it's about. It's not about territory, really, ultimately. I think it's about we cannot concede 1 inch of our terrain to these monsters who used to rule us, or these people who we used to rule but who are now challenging us in the Japan Sea. So it's very emotional.
So I just wondered how much actually the oil
historically, nationalism.
The petroleum that they envisioned.
There are valuable resources there. There's no question. But the really valuable resource right now is nationalist populist politics.
That's okay.
And that's what gets people elected. I mean, this landslide election in Japan recently, that's a big part of what it was about. Saying a line about our national pride includes big claims, which are very hard to carry out once you're in office. Yes?
How, given this nationalist pride and focus on we are the best in a certain sense, kind of cultural, imperialistic point of view, how about economically, how how dependent is Japan on exports for basically everything? We know they have water, you know, but for everything else, like when I think of California, I think, yeah, we can pretty much be self-sufficient, except for water, right? Japan, not having a lot of the resources it needs for that technophilia, how do they do it? You know, how much are they dependent on economically colonizing places like the Philippines or Southeast Asia or wherever it is that they do it? I remember when you know, redwoods here in California, the big thing when Pacific Lumber was cutting them is that they were shipping whole logs to Japan. So how dependent is Japan on basically these relationships?
Completely. Completely. As actually are we, I think. We have a bigger grain basket relative to our population, right? We can actually export grain. So in some ways we're okay, but that requires oil. The way we farm it, it's very energy intensive. So I would say we're all playing a pretty dicey game, but they've been doing it for a long time, a very long time.
And are they creating the alternatives? You know, like we talk about in this country, oh, let's go solar, let's renewable, et cetera.
They tried nuclear power.
Are they ahead of? Are they ahead behind China? You know.
Well, this is a really interesting issue to watch right now in the wake of the Fukushima disaster and the nuclear meltdown, because until then, nuclear was getting to be a bigger and bigger share of Japan's energy, and that's the real key resource they don't have enough of. If they put the brakes on nuclear completely, they will become dependent on coal and oil to an extremely high degree. This has global warming implications. I don't know if any of you have seen this new movie, Pandora's Promise. I would recommend it. It's going to be available free on the internet. They're going to put it out on iTunes this fall. It's a very provocative case, kind of rhetorical case for nuclear energy. Carefully regulated, but as the only solution to global energy requirements that will not result in massive global warming. It's a very, very interesting film. I would just say take a look. I can't say that I've done the research to know whether I can endorse their viewpoint or not, but it really raises the question in a very interesting way. And I'd say Japan, in the wake of the Fukushima disaster, the policy wonks and kind of Japan experts are just hovering, waiting to see what the Japanese public is going to do about its nuclear dependence.
In terms of natural resources, you referenced, and so did the speaker yesterday, that there were mineral resources in Japan that were quite abundant at one point, which I was surprised by.
Yes.
Was that just silver, or was it other?
So silver was the biggest one, and this is another of those rule of thumbs that I think is useful to know. During the 1500s, from the 1500s into the very early 1600s, precisely the period when New World silver from Mexico and Peru was flooding the world market, almost all of it going to China, as you probably know. That's where the big demand for silver was. Vastly growing economy really needed to be lubricated. Japanese silver mines were pouring out 30% of all the new silver coming on the market during precisely those years. It's stunning. We don't know this. We don't know this. And that is much to account for the wealth of the Tokugawa, of the Tokugawa shoguns. That has a lot to do with their rise and their ability to basically buy off the warlords and bring them in. The silver started to peter out early in the Tokugawa years. It was replaced for a while with copper and gold. They exported copper and gold to Europe. They shut off the gold in the 1680s, and the only thing left that the Dutch were carrying, you know, the Dutch had that little foothold in Nagasaki, right, on Dejima. The only thing they were carrying all the way back to Europe was copper.
That is so extraordinary.
Yeah.
I never even would have thought that, much less gold.
Not only that, but in the early age of the steamships, at the time Perry came to Japan, he asked for three things: a shipwreck convention, so because whaling, you end up losing a lot of sailors. You get out in a little boat with a harpoon stuck in a whale, it's easy to get lost at sea. So They wanted repatriation rights for their shipwrecked sailors who washed up in Japan. That was one of the big demands that the US wanted. It's the heyday of Pacific whaling, Moby Dick era.
Okay.
They wanted water and provisions for their steamships that were starting to come into the Pacific, and they wanted coal. Coal. Japan, it turns out, had big deposits of coal, which had been burned on a very small local scale, supporting kilns where salt was boiled down, or miso was made, or pottery was made. But it became a major export. The Japanese were sending huge shiploads of coal to Shanghai for British, as well as Chinese and American consumption in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s.
How did they, given what happened in other cultures, it seems like they would have been at risk of, you know, intense efforts at colonialization, you know, in order to exploit those resources, yet they did resist it.
Yes, that's a wonderful question, and I think I have an answer to that. I've really been intrigued by that for a long time, and the most compelling answer I've come up with is this. What the Americans, the British, the French, the Germans, and the Russians were all really keen about was China.
Yeah, they were.
They really wanted the China market. They wanted the tea. The British wanted the tea. Everybody wanted the ceramics. Everybody wanted the market. They thought they'd be able, just like now, the big romance is figuring out how to sell to the billion Chinese. Japan was protected at this point in its history by being next to China. Japan's function in the mindset of the Americans, who were the first to really successfully knock on the door there, was to be a stepping stone to China. So the Japanese negotiate. They say, we don't want any opium. Okay, no opium, fine. We'll sell our opium to China. If you'll just give us water and coal and provisions for our ships, we'll leave opium out. That was huge. That was huge. Right? And we'll keep our missionaries in the port cities, and we won't invade you with Christianity. And yes, we will sell our technology to you, and yes, we will send people I call colonial mercenaries. Exactly the same kind of people who colonized other countries were hired by the Japanese government to help the Japanese government do exactly the same thing to its own population. Let's build schools and make everybody go to school. Let's build hospitals and institute vaccinations. Let's build modern roads, and sort of self-colonization, assess our own geological resources, etc. But it's all going to go to the Meiji government. It's going to stay local. The resources are going to stay local. And they were very careful about strategically borrowing money, but not very much on the international markets. So they didn't even get sucked in till very, very late into financial dependence on world capital markets. So they were able to build slowly and kind of surreptitiously. They built their own empire, piggybacking on the British and the American empires in the Pacific, because they provided a useful service to those empires. And that, I think, is absolutely key. Yeah?
When you mentioned that Perry was arranging for reparations of stranded sailors, so before that, what did they do to the sailors? Did they kill them, or just kind of adopt them into their society?
So Perry comes in the 1850s, right, 1853, and whaling has only been going since about the 1840s. 1820s, it's starting in the southern Pacific. I think it's the 1840s before they're really up in the northern Pacific. So it's just a live issue now. It's not that they would be killed, but there were no diplomatic relations between Japan and almost any other country in the world. They had diplomatic relations with the Dutch. They did not have diplomatic relations with China, just Korea. Korea and the Dutch, who else? The Ainu, you know, they go back and forth with the Ainu, but nobody else was allowed in Japanese waters. So it was just this quandary. And if somebody washed up on shore and it could be dealt with kind of under the table, you could try to get them out of the country. But if it became known to the shogun or to some official of the shogun, then it was trouble, because there simply was no precedent for dealing with this. And the prestige of the central government depended on being able to maintain this 250-year-old rule that no foreigners were allowed in Japan's waters. And that became untenable pretty fast. And when it did, the government collapsed. They had to come up with some new system. So yes, on both sides, it wasn't possible for Japanese who got shipwrecked to be repatriated either. There was just no protocol for doing it. So that's a problem once mobility begins to creep up on the Pacific.
I just wanted to say thank you. This isn't a question, but just a comment. That I think we should have a scholar speak at all of our institutes, situating us into like the geography and the environment of any
location or area that we studied. I think that was so valuable. And that it was a great reminder to, you know, look at geography and spatial relationships in an area to find the stories and the histories between people and how they're impacted by that. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. It's really fun. I've enjoyed getting ready for this too, just anticipating. I worship at the feet of elementary school teachers. I think what you do is really hard. I'm always glad to go to work and leave my children in your hands, or I always was. Yes, you laugh knowingly. So I'm delighted if there's something here that's useful.
How's your children?
Well, now they're teenagers. Okay. One's just heading into high school and the other's just finishing high school. But
since you're from Stanford, do you want to talk about SPICE at all? Is it still active?
That is the context in which I have done my middle school talk. So SPICE, I don't even remember exactly what the acronym stands for, Stanford Program in International Curriculum and Education or something like that. It grew out of the East Asian Center at Stanford, and it now encompasses all kinds of global education, and I'm sure they have a useful website because one of the things they've done is develop curriculum units that are ready to go for teachers, and I think they distribute them free or virtually free.
And it's called SPICE?
Yes.
Sorry, the way
SPICE, S-P-I-C-E at Stanford. I'm sure you'll find it.
This is one that's on the back table.
Oh, good.
You're right. It has a whole thing on folklore and how to do it in their point of view.
So they run institutes like this. They bring, I don't know about the other ones, but I know they do bring middle school teachers to Stanford periodically for just a day. I don't think they do a whole week, but.
Like to say, as a person on the peninsula, the public programs at Stanford are phenomenal.
Oh, good.
Well, they've been doing, you know, the conflicts of drones and South Africa. They are, and every year they're spectacular.
They also have a summer international film festival where they show free films on Wednesday nights. If you're in the area, that's kind of nice too. I'm glad to hear that, because it's not Berkeley. We are not embedded in the community in the same way. Although these days, I guess we are embedded in Silicon Valley. So we live in interesting times, don't we?
Well, thank you very much. That was a delight.
Oh, good.
To hear.
Oh, good. Let's these guys. Have fun with the insect boys.
So let's take about a 10-15 minute break, so we'll come back at 5 after.